Welcome to our Sunday worship service. It's been a while, but we'll be continuing with our study of Philippians today. Last time that we were here, we were on chapter 2, the first 11 verses. If you remember, that was a centerpiece for the entire book, where we find this grand praise song about the gospel, the most important event in human history. You see, Christianity is not based on a particular moral teaching or the golden rule. It's based on a particular historical event, which the biblical scholars called the Christ event, where God, I'm talking about the God of the universe, came down as a human being. And it says, He emptied himself by taking the form of a servant, being born in the likeness of men. It says that God emptied himself, of his transcendence, of his glory. And then he came down to our level. And then we find him going right past our level and going below our level, all the way down to the point of being humiliated and tortured to death on the cross. Why? Why? To pay the penalty for our sins on our behalf so that we can be forgiven. This is the good news of the gospel, that God who knows your frailty, the God who knows your brokenness, God who knows our shame and our sin, did not reject you, did not reject us, did not merely even put up with you, but he loves you this much, to the point of dying for you. Now, if that's true, if that's what God really did, then you know what, that changes everything. Now, you might be hearing this message, and the idea that a religion could be based on a historical event rather than a bunch of moral teachings, that idea could be kind of new to you. You might even question, how do we know that there is a God to begin with? How can you possibly believe that Jesus was the Son of God? What does that even mean? Those are valid questions, and I want to really encourage you to look into the answers, because you might be shocked to find that there are some surprisingly intellectual and satisfying answers to that. But that is for another day, another talk. For now, let's go with Apostle Paul's letter to the Philippians. He is saying to the Philippian Christians, look, this is what happened. And you guys in the Philippian church, you believe this. You know this. Then in verse 12, he says, Therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed. So it starts with the word therefore. Okay? It starts with the word therefore. In other words, all the exhortations that he's about to write, it arises out of the gospel. And this is what he says, Therefore, my beloved, as you have always obeyed, so now, not only as in my presence, but much more in my absence, work out your own salvation with fear and trembling. As a response to the gospel, we are to work out our salvation. Work out. In 1999, when I got married, my identity changed in an instant. I said I do to Sarah, and boom, that sealed the deal. I became a husband. So, what does that mean? Does that mean I'm done being a husband? No, quite the opposite. That was only the beginning. Since then, I had to work out that identity. And I'm still continuing to work out that identity, or work out that marriage, sometimes with fear and trembling. And that's the case for all meaningful relationships, right? It's like that's our marriage and friendships. We need to work that out. Work out that friendship with your life, with your decisions, so that relationship becomes fuller and more vivid and more real. So this exhortation is saying, don't let your spiritual identity as a Christian remain merely an identity based on one moment in the past when you said, I do. No, you need to work that out so that it gets filled out, so that the love and forgiveness of Jesus doesn't simply remain on the cross only, but it gets lived out, it gets experienced, and then even copied and practiced in our lives. To illustrate that, let me tell you a story of an orphan who's been begging and stealing food his entire life. And then one day, some older British fellow comes by and starts to engage in a conversation with this boy. And this boy steals his wallet and runs away. But the next morning, this man comes to the same spot again, gives him food and says, you don't have to steal from me. This boy is scared, but then grabs the food and eats it, keeping a suspicious eye on this man. And this man does this every day, comes over and gives him food and talks to this boy. And one day, he gives this boy a different kind of gift, adoption papers. That's the gift of salvation. And a surreal comedy would be if this kid looked at the paper and says, wow, so you're going to be my dad? And he says, yes. And boy says, "Thank you so much," and he puts the paper into his pocket and goes. And the man says, "Come with me." And the boy goes, "What? Wait a minute. I gotta pay for this gift by going with you? Wait a minute. There are strings attached to this gift." I mean, that would be beyond stupid, right? What is salvation? Salvation is not an admission ticket to heaven. That you can grab and put into your pocket. Salvation is a gift that God offers to be adopted by God. It's an undeserved love relationship with God. And if you said yes to that, therefore, work that out in your life. Live like you're adopted. And he says, and you're supposed to work that out with fear and trembling. I mean, it's difficult for us to, so here, fear and trembling, right? Now, it's difficult for us to actually understand that because the only time we feel fear and trembling is when there's actually negative consequences. Like, you're going to get fired if you don't perform. You're going to get an F if you don't study. So then we study hard with fear and trembling. But since salvation doesn't work that way, it's not like, God will take back his salvation if you don't perform. So then why would we experience any fear and trembling? Well, it's because this fear is not some fear of negative consequences. Rather, it's a fear and trembling that comes with a mission that has been undeservedly entrusted to us. Going back to the adoption illustration, let's say the kid gets it. He's not stupid. He grabs onto this chance. He fully accepts that adoption and moves in with that family. And at first, I imagine that he would just feel so thankful that he doesn't have to beg anymore. He's thankful to be eating 3 meals a day. But he realizes, it's not about just getting food from this family. He's adopted as this man's son, and he eventually realizes, he's a part of this much bigger family, and he gets introduced to the extended family and all that, and he notices, many of his uncles have wounds, and they have these medals. So he asks his uncle, "Uncle Ernest, where did you get that wound?" And he says, "That was the Battle of Trafalgar." And then this boy asks, "You mean the Trafalgar, the most strategic upset victory in naval history?" And this boy realizes, that's his new dad is Horatio Nelson. You are the heir to the greatest naval family of the Royal Navy. That's who you are. You are a Nelson. And this boy starts to study history of the Royal Navy and start to learn about different strategies and ships. And it's not about, I don't have to beg for food anymore because I'm not a beggar anymore. Your identity is so much bigger than that. And this boy gets struck with a sense of mission and honor, and there's a sense of fear and trembling as he puts on the name Nelson. And it's not that Christians need to work out our salvation. Christians get to work out our salvation with fear and trembling and honor as we put on the name of Christ, before whose name, the name of Nelson is really nothing. We're called to a life as a disciple of Christ. It's like King Theoden in Lord of the Rings. As he dies, he says, "I go to my fathers in whose mighty company I shall not now feel ashamed." He lived before the cloud of witnesses, and he was aware of what group he belonged to. And that made him courageous. That's working out your identity in your life. That's an awesome thing, and it's a fearful thing. So, work out your own salvation. It means live out the implications of this gigantic truth. For it is God who works in you both to will and to work for his good pleasure. Apostle Paul reminds us, even as you work out your own salvation, it's God who works in you. So it is us that is, so the question is it us that is supposed to work out our own salvation, or is it God who works it out? The answer is yes, both. There's this kind of duality in the Bible constantly. God is working through us, but that doesn't mean that we go limp. The exhortation to us is still, you work out your own salvation with fear and trembling as God empowers you. Verse 14 through 18 says, "Do all things without grumbling or disputing, that you may be blameless and innocent, children of God without blemish in the midst of a crooked and twisted generation, among whom you shine as lights in the world, holding fast to the word of life, so that in the day of Christ I may be proud that I did not run in vain or labor in vain. Even if I am to be poured out as a drink offering upon the sacrificial offering of your faith, I am glad and rejoice with you all. Likewise, you also should be glad and rejoice with me." The main exhortation here is to do all things without grumbling or disputing. So here's the problem with this verse. We're an active church, and there's a lot of stuff that we're doing. So it's going to be a challenge to do it without grumbling and disputing. After a long day of work or school, you come back home, actually you wish that you could do that, right? After a long day of Zooming and conferencing and staring into screens, right? That's the situation. Roommate says, hey, can you take out the trash and cook? And you're like, cook? I'm sick and tired of cooking. Then you get an email from one of your classmates and say, hey, it's so-and-so's birthday. Look at the camera and say a few words and say wave and dance to this music. And you're like, I don't want to. You want to say, I am not happy birthday to you. I'm not happy. But your EQ is high enough to know not to literally say that, but your heart will say it with a lot of grumbling and disputing. When this shelter in place started, I was thinking, whoa, what do we do as a church? We're not going to be doing anything. It was sort of like that for 1 month as we were trying to figure this out, but then our church started to adapt to this new situation. And man, I think there were more new initiatives and new work created in the last 3 months than any other 3 months of summer. And I got a lot, I think a lot of us got more busier than ever. This is a meme that's out on the internet right now about church. Okay, so it says this. Yeah, I'll let you read that and enjoy it. Yeah. All right, so during this time, we're growing in different skills and getting trained up. All those are good things. I think you know that. But sometimes because of our natural laziness, it's hard to obey this verse. It's hard to do all things without grumbling and disputing, especially in our hearts. Well, how can we have a good attitude about this? Verse 15 gives us a clue. Verse 15 tells us that when we do this, we can be blameless and innocent, and as children of God, blameless and innocent as children of God. There's something about the innocence of children that actually allows them to do things wholeheartedly. When we ask a little child to help you with something, there's something really awesome about their response. A long time ago when my kids were younger, I took a family camping trip, and I wanted to start a campfire, so I asked my girls, hey, I need a little kindling twigs, like small twigs. Can you walk around the area and gather some? And they jumped to action. They were running around. They grabbed a bunch and then brought it back. But they were a little bit too big. They were too thick to start a fire. And I said, I need thinner twigs. Can you go again and gather thinner twigs? What do you think they did? What do you think teens and adults would do? They would say, why didn't you tell me the size before? But children, they say, okay, and they just ran off again. And then, man, their innocence allows them to do things wholeheartedly because they're so eager to please their parents. They would come back, I remember, and say, with the sample twig and says, is this a good one? And I would say, yeah, that's a good one. And they would smile and then run off again. So in doing God's work, behave like children of God. Be eager to please God. And in a way, you're saying to God, look, Dad, I did this for you. Even if the twigs that you picked up were not small enough, even if there was a mid-course adjustment and schedule change, even if the work that you did didn't bear that much fruit, be like children of God, which means you say to God, look, Dad, I did this for you. That's how we can do all things without grumbling or disputing. That's difficult because we're not currently living up to the new identity as the children of God, and that's why we need to work out our salvation in our lives. The rest of the chapter, Apostle Paul describes two people, Timothy and Epaphroditus. And these people are there to give us a vivid picture of what it looks like to work out this gigantic truth of the gospel. It says, I hope in the Lord Jesus to send Timothy to you soon, so that I too may be cheered by news of you. For I have no one like him who will be genuinely concerned for your welfare. For they all seek their own interests, not those of Jesus Christ. But you know Timothy's proven worth, how as a son with a father he has served with me in the gospel. I hope therefore to send him just as soon as I see how it will go with me, and I trust in the Lord that shortly I myself will come also. So that's Timothy, the one that Apostle Paul keeps calling his spiritual son. And here he does it again in verse 22. It says, Timothy, where is it? As a son with a father, right? So he's the go-to man for Apostle Paul. If you have an encouraging group like the Ephesians or the Philippian church, well, send Timothy. Have a very discouraging group like the Corinthians, he sends Timothy. He is the most highly trusted go-to man for Apostle Paul. Man, we want to be that go-to man. We want to be that guy. So what were his skills? There must have been some special skill or talent that Timothy had. What was Timothy awesome at? We have no idea. Actually, his qualifications seem to be that he was very loving, which gets manifested in the fact that he gets genuinely concerned for other people's welfare. And he also puts interests of Christ, which is the gospel, above his own interest. It says, verse 21, they all seek their own interests, but not Timothy. And he also served with Apostle Paul. He says he also served with me. We know that he served alongside of Apostle Paul, who sacrificed a lot for his service to Jesus. And we know that Timothy, he was faithful. He kept holding on. And so therefore, in verse 22, the proven worth that he's talking about here is actually one word, which translates to something like character. In short, the description of Timothy is this, that he was a loving servant for the long haul. When we're young, I think we tend to overemphasize talent and ability, and our infatuation with superheroes and athletes, they really reinforce this same overemphasis. The Bible says, no, it's about faithfulness for the long haul. So do you want to be a trusted person? There are no shortcuts. Here's what you can do. Don't let your love and concern for others grow cold. Another thing you can do is to treat the gospel, which is the interest of Christ, as something greater than your own interests. And finally, serve for the long haul. These things are not dependent on some talent or ability. Notice that anybody can do this. That means anyone can be an encouraging person. And the other person that we can look at is Epaphroditus. It says, I have thought it necessary to send to you Epaphroditus, my brother and fellow worker and fellow soldier, and your messenger and minister to my need. For he has been longing for you all, and has been distressed because you heard that he was ill. Indeed, he was ill, near to death, but God had mercy on him, and not only on him, but on me also, lest I should have sorrow upon sorrow. I am the more eager to send him, therefore, that you may rejoice at seeing him again, and that I may be less anxious. So what's going on is pretty amazing. So Epaphroditus was someone who came from the Philippian church to help Paul during his imprisonment. But he gets really sick to the point where he was near death. Okay? So this is a situation. He's thinking, this is Epaphroditus right here. And he's thinking, I'm going to die. All right? But he's distressed. Why? Because he's looking at the Philippian church. He heard that because you heard that he was ill. So they heard about the fact that he was ill. And then Epaphroditus they're worried, and anxious. And Epaphroditus sees that and goes, oh no, they're worried about me. And so he gets all worried and anxious. And then Apostle Paul looks at the whole thing and goes, oh my gosh, right? And he's looking at this. He gets better. Epaphroditus gets better. So then Apostle Paul is really happy about that. But then he looks at this whole situation and he's worried. And he says, oh gosh, that would have been sorrow upon sorrow. But then, so therefore I am anxious, I'm more eager to send him, and now maybe less, so that I may be less anxious. Right? So Apostle Paul sends Epaphroditus back early. There's a whole lot of anxiety and worries going around here, right? But these kinds of worries and anxieties do not drain us of life and cause us to fall apart, because they are, I think, beautiful anxieties that come from love. So I want to tell you, we might have a lot of different anxieties in our lives that eat away at our sense of peace. Get anxious for the right reasons. You will have worries and anxieties in your life, no matter what. All the data shows that all of our comforts and financial security, which we hope that would get rid of our worries and anxieties, they actually have no correlation on reducing anxieties whatsoever. In fact, the data seems to show that the opposite is true. World Health Organization published their findings 3 years ago that the richer countries suffer from anxiety disorders more. And you have to wonder, why is that the case? Well, maybe because of our individualistic search for personal success, we have isolated ourselves and we've lost this way of life, right? This picture of life, where we feel this kind of love for one another. And that's the right kind of worries to have, where we feel this kind of anxiety for one another. And this is what love looks like. That's what closeness looks like. In my time doing ministry, I feel this kind of anxiety very often, maybe most of the time. And I feel anxious over other people's conditions and their condition. And it's not a pleasant feeling. So why would I make other people's heartaches my own? Why would I take other people's problems and get all anxious about how they're doing? Because to be honest, when I first add them onto my already worry-filled life, it does feel heavier, okay? But eventually, those worries for other people drive out my other self-centered, soul-killing worries. Anxieties like money or how I look or how I perform compared to others. And the space that used to be occupied by those soul-killing anxieties get replaced with a purifying, beautiful anxiety of love. So even though Apostle Paul is in prison and Epaphroditus is there to help him, Roman government didn't really take care of their prisoners in house arrest. So Epaphroditus was there to help him and provide for him. But Apostle Paul sends him back. Paul is doing exactly what he's asking the Philippian church to do, which is to put others' interests above his own, right? Finally, it says, "So receive him in the Lord with all joy and honor such men, for he nearly died for the work of Christ, risking his life to complete what was lacking in your service to me." He says, honor such men. Okay? It's important to honor the right people. Who do you honor? Who do you admire? Some Christians get spooked and say, well, no, you should not honor men. You should only honor God. But if you don't take care to honor the right people, you will end up admiring someone else in the world. You will end up honoring sports stars or CEOs or rich people like they're some amazing moral heroes or something. I want to give you like two drawings. Okay, so drawing one. So I'll give you two guys. Okay, so here's guy number one. Cool guy. Oh, the leg's too big. On a sofa. Cool. This is not a tennis racket. This is a frying pan, okay? With food on it. This is a shovel. Good dig. There's a table. Beautiful table. Okay, so there are two guys, two pictures. Who do you honor? Which one do you admire? This reveals our values. But if you learn to honor the right people, that will also shape our values. As an individual or as a community, you will end up valuing the attributes of the people that you celebrate and honor and admire. This passage tells us honor people who sacrifice themselves for the Lord, people who work hard for the sake of Christ, people who sacrifice their comforts, people who sacrifice for others without grumbling or disputing. Paul says, honor such people. Imagine what it would be like if we took these words seriously and obeyed them. If our church was filled with people who work out their salvation with all seriousness and don't grumble while doing it. Where people have genuine concern and anxiety for one another and we honor the right people. I think we can shine like stars in this world. I think we can live a life that is worthy of the gospel. Amen. At this time, I would just like to give you some time to just think about what you heard today. There were many lessons from the Bible today, about doing things without a grumbling attitude. From the example of Timothy, we talked about loving and serving people for the long haul. From Epaphroditus, we learned how we need to be anxious for the right reasons and how we can shape our values by admiring the right people. I think all of that, falls under the umbrella of working out your salvation to make your salvation fuller and more vivid. So I want to give you a few moments to just reflect or pray about how this applies to you. So let's have that time.